is meant not to kill, but to intimidate, to force Bumpy into subservience. The meeting was in one of Bumpy's own spots, a message in itself. The Lucchese soldiers, cold and professional, laid out their offer of a partnership, a tax, a merger. The threat was unspoken but clear. Bumpy listened, his face unreadable. He let the silence thicken, and then he spoke. His voice was calm, almost conversational. He didn't yell or refuse. Instead, he began to tell a story about Harlem. He described it not as territory, but as a living, breathing organism. He named specific streets, barbershops, diners. He talked about the children playing stickball, the old women on stoops, the shoeshine boys. And then he connected them all, revealing a terrifying truth. Every person, every place he named was a node in his intelligence network. He looked at the lead gunman and said, "The man who fixed that clock last week works for me. The coat-check girl who took your hats is my cousin. The cab driver who brought you here has already reported your license plate to 3 of my men." He then shifted from defense to a devastating offense. He demonstrated not a threat, but knowledge. He mentioned by name Lucchese's mistress, the school his children attended, the route of his Sunday walk, the safe restaurant in Little Italy. He cited secret dates and transactions. The message was clear. I am already inside your life. You see a room, I see a web. You can shoot me, and my people will witness it. And then they will not wage a war you understand. They will dismantle your life, piece by piece, person by person, in ways you cannot predict or stop. Harlem will become a grave for your family, and you will spend your life fearing ghosts. He finished by politely declining their offer, then turned his back and walked slowly out, giving them the ultimate display of power, his vulnerability, knowing they dared not shoot. The soldiers returned to Lucchese and reported every word. Upon hearing the details, the Don paled. His hand, holding the glass, trembled. This wasn't fear of a bullet. It was the terror of a strategist realizing his opponent was 10 moves ahead. The immediate consequence was total retreat. All plans for Harlem were abandoned permanently. A new, unspoken treaty of mutual respect and non-interference was forged. Lucchese later warned others to leave the King of Harlem alone. For Bumpy, this was the peak of his legend. He won a psychological war. Without firing a shot, his stature became mythical. His control over Harlem absolute. For the Mafia, it was a humbling lesson in the limits of their model. They learned that raw, institutional power could be neutralized by deep, intelligent local control. A permanent border was drawn around Harlem. The legacy of that day is a masterclass in power. Lucchese represented the power of the system, hierarchy and centralized force. Bumpy represented the power of the ecosystem, network, community, and intelligence. The system is strong, but blind outside its domain. The ecosystem is all-seeing within it. Bumpy turned his greatest perceived weakness, his deep roots in a single observing community, into his ultimate unassailable strength. He proved that authority from loyalty and respect can be more terrifying than authority from fear. He didn't defeat the Mafia with strength. He paralyzed them with knowledge. The lesson is timeless. The most formidable defense is not a thicker wall, but 1,000 eyes. To rule a kingdom, you must become its memory, its voice, and its ever-watching unseen eye. That unseen eye was not a metaphor. It was a meticulously constructed, living surveillance apparatus more sophisticated than any the Mafia or even the government could deploy with technology of the era. Bumpy's network operated on a principle of reciprocal obligation, the lifeblood of community ignored by the outside world. The old woman on the stoop reported the strange cars not out of fear of Bumpy, but because he had paid her grandson's hospital bill. The shoeshine boy noted the expensive watches and out-of-place accents because Bumpy ensured his family wasn't evicted. The bartender remembered every order because Bumpy kept protection rackets off his business. This created an intelligence engine fueled by gratitude and vested interest, making it immune to Mafia's tools of bribery and coercion. A Lucchese soldier could flash a roll of cash, but he couldn't buy the generational loyalty Bumpy had cultivated. This was a profound depth of his power. He had bureaucratized trust and weaponized social capital. When he listed those specific details to the gunman, He was doing more than showing off. He was performing a real-time audit of his own system's efficacy, demonstrating that every attempt at infiltration had already been logged, categorized, and reported. The message to Lucchese was, "Your centralized command is a liability. My decentralized network is an impenetrable sensor field." This confrontation forced a fundamental rethink in underworld strategy. For Lucchese and the other bosses, it highlighted the vulnerability of their own opaqueness. They operated behind layers of insulation, lawyers, fronts, button men, which protected them from the law, but also isolated them from the ground truth. Bumpy, in contrast, was embedded in the ground truth. He was a ground truth. His knowledge wasn't gathered. It was inhaled. In the aftermath, the Mafia didn't just avoid Harlem. They studied it. They began to adopt, in their own way, a more cellular structure for certain operations, understanding that resilience lay in local nodes with deep connections, not just in top-down diktats. For Bumpy, the victory cemented a dangerous paradox. By proving himself untouchable to the syndicate, he elevated himself from a local problem to a strategic entity. He was no longer just a Harlem boss. He was a sovereign state actor in the underworld geopolitics. This granted him unprecedented leverage, but also painted the ultimate target on his back. Future negotiations weren't with lieutenants, but directly with figures like Frank Costello or even a remote Lucky Luciano. He had earned a seat at a table he never wanted to sit at, forced to play a game of nations with the cold calculus of the Commission, where his community-based power had less sway. The psychological tremor he sent through Lucchese became part of his permanent dossier. It ensured that any move against it would require not just force, but a comprehensive, societal-level destabilization of Harlem, a price the Pragmatic Commission was never willing to pay. Thus, his legacy is dual. He is the champion who defended his home turf through superior intelligence and social cohesion, a blueprint for community resistance. But he is also the prisoner of that success, forever bound to a monumental reputation that isolated him at the pinnacle, proving that the ultimate cost of making a giant tremble is that you must forever stand as a mountain. To stand as that mountain meant Bumpy Johnson had to master a perilous duality. He was now both the protector, whose strength was drawn from the collective soul of Harlem, and the monument, whose shadow alone could dictate the terms of survival for everyone beneath it. The intelligence network that had saved and became a permanent institution, a dark, efficient civil service. Information flowed upward with ritualistic precision. Street-level observers, newsboys, numbers runners, prostitutes, to neighborhood aggregators, bartenders, barbers, landlords, and finally to Bumpy's inner circle, where it was analyzed not just for threats, but for patterns, weaknesses, and opportunities. This system didn't just defend, it governed. It allowed Bumpy to adjudicate disputes with the omniscience of God, preempt revenge killings by identifying the true aggressor, and allocate resources with the cold efficiency of a social engineer. He became the state, the judiciary, and the welfare system of a parallel Harlem. This institutionalization, however, created a distance. The man who once walked the streets, feeling their pulse, now received distilled reports. The very loyalty that was his fortress also became a filter, as his lieutenants, to maintain his mythic status, might shield him from grubby truths or amplify his legend. The Bumpy who faced Lucchese's men was a tactical genius embedded in the mud of reality. The Bumpy after became a strategic entity, a symbol whose every move was a calculated piece of statecraft. This transformation attracted a new kind of ally and a new kind of enemy. Federal agencies, which had previously seen him as a local nuisance, now recognized in his operation the sophistication of a hostile intelligence agency. They shifted from trying to pin street crimes on him to attempting to map and dismantle his network, a far more difficult task than arresting a mobster. Meanwhile, younger, hungrier black gangsters in his own orbit, like the upstart Frank Lucas decades later, saw not just a king to respect, but a system to eventually usurp or replicate. Bumpy's greatest challenge post-Lucchese was no longer external invasion, but internal entropy, maintaining the fervent, personal loyalty of a new generation who knew him as a legend, not as the man who saved their father's store. He had to balance the ruthless calculus required to deal with the Commission, which might involve sacrificing a small-time operator to maintain a larger peace, with a protector ethos that was the source of his power. Every deal with the Mafia, even a peaceful one, was a potential crack in his foundational myth. The legacy of that single confrontation, therefore, rippled through time. It created the template for the modern drug lord as community benefactor and shadow governor, a figure Pablo Escobar would emulate in Medellin. It demonstrated that the most potent rebellion against a corrupt system is not to destroy it, but to build a more efficient, more personally loyal alternative within its neglected spaces. But it also revealed the inherent tragedy of such power. To defend a kingdom perfectly, you must eventually separate from its people. You cease to be a man of the street and become its architecture. Bumpy Johnson won his freedom from a Mafia's yoke, but in doing so, he forged himself into the permanent, unapproachable pillar holding up the sky of Harlem. His final lesson is that ultimate power is not about being feared by your enemies. It is about becoming indispensable to your people, and in that indispensability, becoming eternally and perhaps lonely responsible. The tremor in Lucchese's hand was the moment Bumpy's humanity began its slow, necessary metamorphosis into myth, a price for victory that is paid not in blood, but in the quiet solitude of a throne no one else can ever fully see, let alone occupy. This metamorphosis into myth demanded a constant, exhausting performance, a curation of his own legend in real time. Bumpy could no longer afford a moment of perceived weakness, a hint of indecision, or a flash of uncontrolled anger. Every public gesture, from the cut of his suit to the deliberate slowness of his speech, was now a piece of strategic communication aimed at multiple audiences. His people, who needed to see invincibility, the Mafia, who needed to be reminded of his omniscience, and the authorities, who needed to be confounded by his impenetrable respectability. He became a master of symbolic power. Where a Mafia don might send a dead fish as a warning, Bumpy's warnings were more psychological. A rival might find that every cab in Harlem suddenly refused to pick him up. A snitch might discover that his usual brand of cigarettes was mysteriously unavailable at every store from 110th to 155th Street. These were not just punishments. They were demonstrations, proof that Bumpy's could alter the very fabric of daily reality in the kingdom. This performance extended to his dealings with the white establishment. He learned to weaponize his eloquence and manners, using them as a shield and a probe. In meetings with corrupt politicians or nervous police captains, his impeccable decorum was more disarming than any threat. It forced them to engage with him not as a savage to be suppressed, but as a peer to be negotiated with, thereby implicitly recognizing his sovereignty. This psychological warfare on all fronts took a profound personal toll. The man known for his love of poetry and chess, for his quiet generosity, was forced to submerge those private softnesses beneath the carapace of Bumpy Johnson, the Godfather. The network that protected him also imprisoned him in a gilded cage of his own making. Trust, the currency of his rise, became his scarcest resource. He could trust loyalty, but he had to distrust the motivations behind it. Was a man loyal to him, or to the idea of him? Was he being protected? Or was he being preserved as the central figure in a profitable ecosystem? The line between devoted subject and parasitic courtier blurred dangerously. This internal pressure forged a new kind of leadership philosophy, one of radical, calculated detachment. He began to rule not through the warmth of personal connection, but through the awe-inspiring, flawless function of the system he had built. His power became less about who he was, and more about what it set in motion. A self-perpetuating engine of control, intelligence, and economic redistribution that could, in theory, run without him. In this, he achieved a terrible form of immortality, engineering his own evolution from a man to an institution. The legacy of the Lucchese confrontation, therefore, is not just a story of a street victory, but a case study in the alchemy of power. It shows how raw defiance, when tempered by brilliant strategy and deep community ties, can be refined first into authority, then into autonomy, and finally into a form of sovereignty. But the final product of that alchemy is not a happier man or a freer one. It is a perfected symbol. Bumpy Johnson saved Harlem from one form of conquest only to bind it and himself to the immense, beautiful, and burdensome architecture of his own legend. He became the silent, watchful mountain, not to be climbed, but to be relied upon for shelter, to define the horizon,